So my sport of choice in high school was basketball. And I know that's like, thank you for that. Not sure if I thank you that or I'm offended. I'm not quite sure yet, but I know it's a surprise to many of you, with this 5'9" and 3/4 height and less than athletic body frame, but I played basketball. I was on the basketball team, not necessarily played. Like my senior year, my mom washed my jersey once, if that gives you any indication of my athletic ability. Anyway, I don't know why I'm telling you all. I'm just bringing up some emotions. Anyway, I graduated high school and I get to college and discover this cool thing called intramurals. And after intramurals, I discover like adult leagues where you can go play basketball and you don't have to practice. You don't have a coach yelling at you. You just pay the fee and you show up and you play. And so throughout my adult life, I played basketball, pickup games, organized leagues, and it's a lot of fun. Now, what I lack in height and athletic ability, I make up for in scrappiness, okay? So my theory is if they're gonna give me 5 fouls in the game, I'm gonna use them all. I don't wanna leave the game with like 3 fouls left, so I use them all. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I was playing in a pickup game and I was down in the paint. If you're not a basketball person, that's where all the tall people hang out. I should have been on the 3-point line, but I was down there just getting scrappy, mixed up, and I go up for a rebound with these super tall guys, and I go up for it, and I don't know what happened, but the next thing I know, this right ring finger either hit the ball or somebody's face. I don't know what happened, but the next thing I know, I'm in excruciating pain, and it instantly balloons up, and I cannot move this thing. Now, I don't do well with things like that. I just don't, and it happened, and so I go and I sit down and I get lightheaded at things like that. Like, you okay? And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm fine. And I'm not, like the fingers just swell up, and I was like, oh my goodness, I've jammed this thing horribly. And so finish the game and go home and I go ice this thing. Try to get some sympathy from Brianna. Did not, we were working through that thing. She goes, I told you, and be careful. So I ice it. And then next day, still swollen, and I try to ice it again, and then a couple of days turn into the week, still the same way. The week turns into a few weeks turns into a month, 1 month turns into 6 months later. It's still swollen, and I can barely bend this thing. Now, I'm no doctor, but I'm going, that may not be a jammed finger. And Brianna's like, you should go to the doctor. I was like, oh, it's fine. So 6 months later, I finally go to the doctor. Show up to the doc and he goes, let's take an x-ray. And he puts it up there. He goes, you broke your finger. And I was like, okay. And he goes, when did you do this? And I was like, 6 months ago. Now, I don't think legally doctors can call their patients idiots, but he gave me a look like what, 6? He goes, 6 months ago. He goes, why didn't you come in then? I was like, I don't know. Yeah, I'm busy, whatever. And so I go, well, what are you gonna do? He goes, nothing. Like, what do you mean? And he gave me it was like a shoestring. I'm sure it was a better thing than that, but just like tied the fingers together. And he was like, your knuckle, it's gonna be swollen. He goes, you should have come in 6 months ago. And I was like, oh, so this knuckle, it's a little bit bigger than the others, but it's my knuckle and it's special to me, all right? Don't make fun of it. Why did I share that with you? I share that with you because you've been wounded or hurt or gone through some pain. And I think for many of us, bitterness, anger, resentment, or we'll just call the whole thing unforgiveness, sets into our hearts and our minds like that. A wound happens, and instead of dealing with it and going through the healing process, we harbor unforgiveness in our lives. I'll deal with it later. I'll talk about it later. It's too painful. It's too fresh. We harbor unforgiveness in our lives. The process of forgiveness is such a vitally important process in the healing process. In my line of work, in ministry and being a pastor, I get a front row seat to people's pain. I get a front row seat to people's pain. Walk with people through some very difficult times. And if you want to know what goes on behind closed doors, you go, I wonder what goes on behind closed doors. I know and have seen what goes on behind closed doors. And unfortunately, I've seen human beings do some awful, devastating things to other human beings. Emotionally, mentally, physically, unmet expectations, abuse, neglect, lying, cheating, stealing. Human beings can just destroy other human beings. And it's easy to allow unforgiveness to set into our lives. And it doesn't matter the amount of pain. If you've been hurt, if you've been lied to, if you've been wounded, then you know this idea of forgiveness and wrestling with this idea of unforgiveness. And so the topic today is unforgiveness is overrated. Unforgiveness is overrated. Now, I think it's similar to the topic of worry, and I think it's similar to the topic of quitting we talked about the past 2 weeks. I don't think many people would go, I disagree with you. I think most people would go, yeah, unforgiveness is overrated. However, many of us harbor this unforgiveness, this feeling of resentment, of bitterness, of anger toward the other person. Why do we do that? Let me propose one idea, what I've seen so often in my ministry, and it's simply this, is that unforgiveness gives us a false sense of leverage over the other person. Unforgiveness gives us a false sense of leverage over the other person, meaning you hurt me, you lied to me, you cheated on me, you abused me, you neglected me, you failed to meet my expectations. I'm hurt, I'm offended, I'm wounded. You've gone on about your life. And so this unforgiveness, resentment is the only way that I can get even with you. And if we hold on to it, it gives us this false sense of leverage against the other person. But the reality is what unforgiveness really does is unforgiveness, it just severely limits our own lives. Unforgiveness severely limits our own lives. Instead of leveraging whatever we think we want to leverage over the other person, all unforgiveness, bitterness, anger, resentment does is it severely limits our own lives. Earlier this week, I read an article from John Hopkins, and it was on forgiveness and what it does to the human body. And here's just part of the article, what it said. It said, whether it's a simple spat with your spouse or a long-held resentment toward a family member or friend, unresolved conflict can go deeper than you may realize and may be affecting your physical health. The good news, studies have found that the act of forgiveness can reap huge rewards for your health, lowering the risk of heart attack, improving cholesterol levels and sleep, and reducing pain, blood pressure, and levels of anxiety, depression, and stress. And then later would go on to quote Dr. Karen Schwartz, and she would say this: there's an enormous physical burden to being hurt and disappointed. And on the topic of forgiveness, she would say, forgiveness, it is an active process in which you make a conscious decision to let go of negative feelings, whether that person deserves it or not. And so unforgiveness gives us this false sense of leverage against the other person. If I harbor this against them, then somehow, some way, it's hurting them. And the reality is all it does is hurt us, not only mentally and relationally, but also physically. I'll illustrate it this way. It's like carrying around this 25-pound weight for your entire life, and me carrying around this weight thinking that it's affecting you. So I'm going to carry this weight, I'm going to drag this weight with me everywhere I go, thinking that somehow you're going to be affected by it. And the reality is you've moved on with your life. You've hurt me, you've caused me pain, you've offended me, you've wounded me. And so I harbor unforgiveness, bitterness, resentment in my own life, and all it does is it severely limits us. But we carry it and we drag this weight along with us wherever we go. And we wonder why our lives are severely limited. I mean, imagine if you carried this thing literally everywhere you went. Like you're flying out on a business meeting tomorrow morning. Imagine going through TSA, dragging this thing with you. Is it going to be a carry-on, or you're going to check this in? What are you going to do? No, I'm just going to drag it with me on the airplane. Imagine giving like your quarterly sales report with this thing. If you'll notice up here, our sales are dipping in this area, but up over here. And by the way, have you seen my 25-pound weight? Imagine going on a very first date and you show up and you meet her for the very first time. What's this? It's my 25-pound weight, perfectly normal for a human being to carry everywhere they go. And we laugh, but we do that with unforgiveness and bitterness and resentment. And it just becomes this thing that if I drag this long enough, somehow in our mind we've convinced ourselves that it affects you, that it hurts you. And the reality is all it does is it limits our own lives. Unforgiveness severely limits our lives, our relationships, our mental thought process, and even our health. Now, Jesus taught and modeled forgiveness at the highest levels and extremes. And he gives this interesting teaching and story on forgiveness to one of his disciples that asked a question. And the story is a fascinating story. It's a parable. But Jesus would use it to illustrate a massive, big idea. But also this idea is so simple and profound. And it's a way that you can begin to process forgiveness in your own life if you could grasp this big idea and just how simple it is. If you got a Bible, grab it. Go to Matthew chapter 18. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry about it. They're going to put it up on the screen. Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to pick it up in verse 21. Here's what Matthew writes. It says, "Then Peter came to him and asked, 'Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times?'" I'll just stop right there. I love the disciple Peter. I just relate with him because he just says what everybody else is thinking. But I think it's interesting that Peter, he doesn't go, "Hey, how often should I expect to be forgiven when I offend somebody?" He goes, no. How often, these people are going to offend me. How often do I need to forgive them? Now, typical teaching by the rabbis in that day was if somebody offended you, 3 times was the maximum amount you needed to forgive somebody. So Peter comes to Jesus like, "Hey, 7 times? Like, I'll go more than double what's typically taught. Is that enough?" And look at what Jesus' response. Verse 22. "No, not 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. Now just stop right there. Jesus is not saying, "Hey, listen, get you a little clicker, and when you hit 491, you're off the hook." Not saying that. He's saying, no, don't put limits on your forgiveness. It's bigger than 3, it's bigger than 7, it's an unlimited amount. And then he tells this fascinating parable to describe it, verse 23. He says, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, 'Please be patient with me, and I'll pay it all.' Then his master was filled with pity for him and released him and forgave his debt. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged him for a little more time. 'Be patient with me and I will pay it,' he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw this, they were upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. Then the king called in the man he had forgiven and said, 'You evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?'" And Jesus tells this fascinating parable, and here's what he's trying to describe and depict, and it's your heavenly Father's forgiveness towards you. And the king represents the heavenly Father and just this massive debt toward you and toward me as followers of Jesus. He goes, in return, that's the forgiveness that you should offer. I'll phrase it for you this way. The forgiveness you give should mirror the forgiveness you have received. The forgiveness that you give should mirror the forgiveness that you have received. And what's interesting is the man was so focused on how much he was owed, or how much he had to forgive, that he forgot how much he was forgiven. And so Jesus tells this parable like millions of dollars and a few $1,000s, and he didn't forgive him. And the crowd listening and Peter and you and I today were going, well, that doesn't make sense. Like a guy completely missed it. I'll put it in today's terms. Let's say later this week, your mortgage company calls you, goes, "Hey, you seem like a really nice person, and we're feeling in a giving mood. Your mortgage is paid in full. God bless, have a great day. Tell Mountain Lake Church we said hello," all right? And you're like so shocked. You're going, "Is this a prank call?" They're like, no, we're going to mail you the paid in full title. It'll be in the mail. Don't worry. God bless, have a great day. You're going, "Oh my goodness." And then imagine that afternoon, you go find your buddy that owes you $10 from lunch last week, and you grab him by the throat and demand instant payment for the waffle fries and sweet tea. You go, "Well, that's ludicrous." Absolutely it is. This is what Jesus is describing. The debt that you've been forgiven, and the forgiveness you give should mirror that. And you go, well, what debt have we been forgiven? Let me just boil it down for you very, very simply. And the debt that you and I have been forgiven as followers of Jesus moves us from an eternity in hell to an eternity in heaven. Eternity of pain and suffering forever to eternity of glory in heaven forever. That is the forgiveness that we receive, an eternal forgiveness, but we're so focused on the earthly things, the temporary things, that we hold it against somebody else because it feels like it gives us a false sense of leverage, but we've been forgiven this massive amount. Now, hear me very, very carefully. The pain that you've walked through, the wound that you've experienced is hurtful, is painful, has probably caused a lot of damage. Again, in my line of work, I get a front row seat to that. I get a listening ear to all that. I'm fully aware of all of that. I'm fully aware of the pain and the hurt and the wounds that one human being can do to another human being. I mean, this man was owed a few $1,000s. The man borrowed it and could not pay it back. I mean, he was owed it. But what Jesus is trying to teach is a bigger eternal principle. And that what you have been forgiven for, that you should mirror that to the people around you. And what's interesting, when Jesus is talking about forgiveness, when he talks about forgiveness and he says, the debt that you've been forgiven of, you should forgive others of, that word in the original language, that in the Greek, it means to release. It means to let go of. It means to send away. Now, hear me very carefully, because I walk through people through this a lot, and you got to understand that forgiveness is not these three things. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Forgiveness is not trusting again, and forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is releasing or letting go. So you can forgive and not be reconciled. You can forgive and never trust that person again. You can forgive and never forget that experience, that wound, that heartache, but you can release it and not walk with or carry that burden. I'll illustrate it for you this way. Let's say later this week, you're on 400 headed north in 5 o'clock rush hour traffic. You're headed there, you're going a blazing 1 mile an hour. And that's lightning quick. And you're there and you're kind of frustrated. And all of a sudden, you look over to the car to your left and you see me. And you're going, hey, it's my preacher, except he doesn't seem to be all that happy, and steam's coming out of my ears and there's fire from my eyes because I love Atlanta except for the traffic. And so I'm trying to maintain my Christianity and my pastoral dignity, but it's about to blow. And so you look over and you wave and you expect to get a wave back from me, but instead what you get is fire from my eyes, and I snap and I barrel through the front of your car, get onto the shoulder and peel out and head on home. You're floored because you're going, oh my goodness, my pastor nearly ran me off the road. Next Sunday at church, you're going, hey, I'm not sure if you know this, but you nearly ran me off the road. And I go, hey, it's Atlanta, deal with it. Now, you can forgive, and you and I may never be reconciled. You go, man, I'm not going to be friends with him. I'm not going to reconcile. But you can still forgive. You can forgive and never trust me again. Man, if that's the way he acts, I'm never going to trust him, but you can still forgive. And you can forgive and never forget the jerk preacher that ran you off the road. But forgiveness is for you to release the weight that you've been carrying, the resentment, the anger, the bitterness, the unforgiveness. Forgiveness is saying, listen, I release it, whether we're reconciled, whether I trust you or not, whether I forget this or I remember for the rest of my life, I can still forgive. And that forgiveness you give should mirror the forgiveness that you have received. Now again, been in ministry and walking through people through some difficult times, and I've heard this, and I'm sure you have. You may have even said something like this. I just can't forgive because, and you fill in the blank. I just can't forgive because it's too painful. I can't forgive because it's too big of a mistake. I can't forgive because it's too fresh. I can't forgive because they're too close to me. I can't forgive because, and fill in the blank. What I want you to know is I want you to go back to verse 32. Look at verse 32. It says, then the king called to the man he had forgiven and said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Don't miss this. The man could have and should have forgiven the smaller debt because of the larger debt. You can't forgive the earthly debt against you because of the eternal debt that you've been given. You can forgive because of what you have been forgiven for. And it's not underneath your own power, but by the power of the Spirit of God and the grace that's poured in you and through you. The man could have forgiven and should have forgiven because of what he had been forgiven for. But don't miss this. Had he not been forgiven the millions, then how in the world could he forgive the thousands? Because he would need it to pay the larger debt. But you and I have been forgiven, moved from an eternity in hell to an eternity in heaven. And you can forgive that person for what they did, how they hurt you, how they lied to you, how they wounded you deeply. You can forgive, not by your own power, but by the power of God's grace working in you and through you and realizing, here's what I've been forgiven for, and begin to work through that process. And forgiveness is the most important part of that healing process of whatever wound that you've experienced. Now again, in my own life and just walking through people, things like this, what I have noticed and I have observed a lot is usually the deeper the wound, the longer that forgiveness process takes. Usually, the deeper the wound, the pain, the longer that forgiveness process takes. It's like if you get a paper cut versus like a deep gash. It's just different healing times. But it is possible. It is possible to work through forgiveness for that person and to let go or to release the anger, bitterness, resentment, unforgiveness that you have been carrying. So what's interesting is when Peter goes, how many times should I forgive this person? And Jesus essentially goes, it's an unlimited amount. And in Peter's mind, I'm sure he was thinking, well, he's going to offend me and offend me and offend me. But for many of you, you may have had one encounter, one painful thing by that person, but the ramifications have lasted months or years. So it's one event, but the collateral damage, man, you're reminded of every day, every month, every year, for decades. And so how in the world do you forgive? For many of you, it's a daily, some of you, it's a moment by moment to release and to forgive. You've been carrying that hurt, that wound, that pain, you've been dragging along with you. And so you may just need to say today, Lord, I work through forgiveness and today I forgive them. But tomorrow, you know what happens? Satan knows you and he knows me, and he's going to go, hey, you sure you want to let that go? I mean, they really deserve it. Well, why don't you carry around this anger just a little bit longer? Why don't you carry around the resentment just a little bit longer? And so you wake up and say, Jesus, because you've forgiven me, I forgive them, and I release it, and I move on about that life. And the next day, Satan's like, are you sure? You know, unforgiveness, anger, it makes a really nice security blanket. And besides, you've been carrying this weight around too long. I'm not sure you're going to know what life is like without it. Why don't you pick it up and carry it up a little bit longer? And so for many of you, the pain of the wound is so deep, it's a daily thing going, Jesus, I forgive them because you've forgiven me. Jesus, I forgive them because you forgive me. I release it today. I release it in this moment. I'm not going to carry it with me. And the only way you can do that and I can do that is through the power and grace of Jesus. Because again, human beings, we cause some massive damage to people. We say things, we do things, there's abuse, there's neglect, there's lying, there's cheating, there's affairs, there's bribes, there's disappointments, there's unmet expectations, there's broken promises after broken promises. But as followers of Jesus, the grace we've been given and the forgiveness we've received moves us from an eternity in hell to an eternity in heaven. And Jesus is going, let that be your mindset when you think about all the earthly things that have happened to you and to me, and you release it. You may not be reconciled. You may never trust that person again, and you may not forget what they did to you, but you can release it. You do not have to carry it forward to tomorrow. You can forgive because of what you've been forgiven for, not by your power, but by the power of God. So let me just give you a few tangible things on how to work through and practice forgiveness. First one I'd tell you is I was given a book many, many years ago on forgiveness by a lady named June Hunt. June Hunt, you can Google her name. Her ministry is Hope for the Heart. Hopefortheheart.org is her website. Great ministry, just about different life issues, but many years ago I was given a book on forgiveness, and I liked it for two reasons. First of all, it was that thick, so I'm a fan of that. And the second of all, it's just super practical on how to work through forgiveness in your own heart. She talks about a lot of different life issues, but forgiveness is one of them, hopefortheheart.org. Some of you honestly might need to sit down with a professional Christian counselor. Professional counselors have some amazing tools for you to go, okay, I know I need to release this. I know I need to let it down. How do I do that on a daily practical basis? And Christian counselors, man, they have some wonderful tools to equip you to go, that is how you release it. For some of you, you might just need to do your own study on forgiveness through Scripture. If you've got the YouVersion Bible app, you can search forgiveness and find some really fantastic Bible studies and Bible reading plans that you can study on the topic of forgiveness. I was given this tip earlier this year. If you're familiar with the Lord's Prayer, if you begin to pray through that prayer, when you get to that part, Lord, forgive me my sins as I forgive those who sin against me. Whenever you say that, as I forgive those who sin against me, my guess is there's that person or that group that comes to the top of your mind. And just daily, just going, Lord, please forgive me my sins as I forgive those who sin against me. And over time, that person, that group, or that thing, it will begin to dwindle. Because it's a daily thing of releasing and letting go of the unforgiveness in your own heart. You may not be reconciled, you may not trust him again, you may not forget it, but you can forgive and release. And again, whenever I preach on the topic of forgiveness, I'll be honest with you, it's a super heavy, weighty topic. Because I understand that in a room this size, there's a lot of different hurts, disappointments, pains, wounds. Some have been suppressed pretty deep down, and all of a sudden, the past few minutes, they've come up to the surface. Man, and there's some deep wounds that you have really yet to heal over correctly, and all of a sudden, they've surfaced to the top. This idea of forgiveness is not a light or an easy topic, but it is such a valuable and important topic. Because as followers of Jesus, the forgiveness that you and I have received from our Heavenly Father, you and I should mirror that to the people in our life. The earthly forgiveness we should give because of the eternal forgiveness that we've received. And so I've been praying for you this week. I don't know what you've been going through. I don't know what name comes to the top of your mind today. I don't know what event comes to the top of your mind today, but I've been praying for you this week. Now I'll tell you what I've been praying for you, and it's out of Colossians chapter 3, verse 13. Paul said this, make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. For many of you, you've been carrying this weight around for a long, long time. And it gives you a false sense of leverage over that person that hurt you. But honestly, all it's doing is just wearing you out. You're exhausted and you're tired and you don't know what to do. Today it's time to go, Jesus, you forgave me, and so I forgive them and I release it. And that might be an hourly thing, that might be a daily thing, but just say, I'm tired of carrying that weight. Lord, as you've forgiven me, I want to forgive them. Let me pray for us.